Keys to Nowhere. Chapter 1. The First Key. Maren van Dijk lived a quiet life in the city of Utrecht. She worked as a librarian in an old building with high ceilings, wooden floors, and shelves filled with forgotten books. She liked silence, order, and the smell of paper. Her days were simple. She arrived early, opened the windows, and sorted books. She didn't talk much to others, but she was kind and helpful. People respected her, even if they didn't know her well. Maren was 39 years old, and she had learned to live with her past by keeping it hidden. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning the back shelves, Maren found a book that hadn't been touched in many years. The cover was faded, and the pages were yellow. Inside, between two chapters, she discovered a key. It was heavy, made of old metal, and had the letter L engraved on its side. She held it in her hand, confused. There was no note, no explanation. She looked around, but no one was near. She placed the key in her pocket and finished her work, trying not to think about it. That night, after closing the library, Maren stayed behind to finish some paperwork. The building was quiet and the lights were dim. As she walked toward the basement to lock the door, she noticed something strange. There was a door she had never seen before. It was small, made of dark wood, and had no handle. Her heart beat faster. She took out the key and, without knowing why, tried it. It fit perfectly. The door opened with a soft sound, and behind it was not a room, but a memory. Maren stepped through and found herself standing in a place she knew too well. It was the cemetery where her mother's funeral had taken place. She had not gone that day. She had stayed home, afraid, angry, and full of regret. Now she was there, watching the people gather, hearing the quiet words, seeing the flowers. She saw herself from the past, sitting alone in her apartment, staring at the wall. She wanted to speak, to move, to change something, but she couldn't. She was only a visitor in time, unable to touch or speak. Tears filled her eyes. She had buried this moment deep inside her, hoping it would fade. But it hadn't. The door had brought it back, clear and strong. She stood there until the scene faded, and the door closed behind her. She was back in the basement, holding the key. It was cold now, and her hands were shaking. She didn't understand what had happened, but she knew it was real. The key had opened a door to her past, to a moment she had never faced. Maren walked home slowly that night. The streets were quiet, and the rain had stopped. She felt different, as if something inside her had shifted. The memory still hurt, but it was no longer hidden. She had seen it, accepted it, and carried it with her. The key stayed in her coat pocket, heavy and silent. She didn't know if it would open another door, but she knew one thing for sure. Some doors are not meant to be locked forever. And sometimes, facing the past is the only way to move forward. Chapter 2. Leo and his door. Leo Hartman lived above his small watch shop in the quiet part of Utrecht. The shop was filled with ticking sounds, soft light, and the smell of metal and oil. He had worked there for most of his life, repairing watches with careful hands and a patient heart. Time was his craft, and he respected it deeply. He was 46 years old, with silver in his hair and lines around his eyes. He didn't speak much, but people trusted him. They brought him broken watches, and he gave them back working and clean. But inside, Leo carried something broken that he could not fix. One morning, while searching through a box of old watch parts, Leo found something strange. It was a key, heavy and cold, with no label or tag. It didn't look like a key for a door or a drawer. It had a smooth surface and a small mark that looked like a faded letter. He didn't remember putting it there. He held it for a long time, feeling its weight. Something about it made him uneasy, but also curious. He placed it on his workbench and continued with his day. That evening, after closing the shop, Leo stayed behind to clean. The room was quiet, and the clocks ticked in rhythm. As he walked toward the back wall, he noticed something unusual. There was a door he had never seen before. It was narrow, with dark wood and no handle. He stared at it, unsure if it had always been there. He picked up the key and, without thinking, tried it. The key fit perfectly. The door opened slowly, and behind it was not another room, but a memory. Leo stepped through and found himself in a familiar place. It was his old family home, the living room where he had last spoken to his brother. The air was tense, and the light was dim. He saw himself standing, angry, refusing to forgive. His brother looked tired, holding a letter in his hand. Leo remembered that day clearly. It was the day he chose silence over healing. He had walked away, and they never spoke again. Now he was watching it all happen again, unable to speak, unable to change anything. The pain returned, sharp and deep. He heard his own voice, cold and final. He saw his brother's face, full of sadness. He wanted to reach out, to say something, but he couldn't. He was only a visitor in time. The door had opened to show him the moment, not to let him fix it. When the scene faded, Leo was back in his workshop. The door was gone, and the key was still in his hand. It felt heavier now, as if filled with the weight of memory. Leo sat down at his bench and looked at the ticking watches around him. He had spent years working with time, measuring it, repairing it. But he had never faced the time he had lost. The door had shown him what he had buried. It had reminded him that some moments stay with us, even when we try to forget. He placed the key in a drawer, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. He didn't know if it would open another door, but he knew it had already opened something inside him. That night, Leo didn't sleep. He sat by the window, listening to the quiet city. He thought about his brother, about the words he didn't say, and the years that had passed. The door had closed, but the memory remained. He understood now that forgiveness was not about changing the past. It was about accepting it and choosing to live differently. The key had not given him a second chance, but it had given him clarity. And sometimes that was enough. Chapter 3. Accidental Meetings. The streets of Utrecht were quiet that morning. The sky was pale, and the air carried the soft chill of early spring. Maren van Dijk walked slowly, her coat buttoned tight, her thoughts drifting. She had taken the day off from the library, needing space to think. The key she had found still rested in her coat pocket, heavy and silent. She didn't know what to do with it, but she couldn't ignore it. It had opened something inside her, something she had kept closed for years. She wandered into a small antique shop she had never noticed before. It was tucked between two buildings, with a faded sign and dusty windows. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and forgotten stories. Leo Hartman was already there, standing near a shelf of old clocks. He liked antique shops. They reminded him of time, how it passed, how it stayed, how it left marks. He wasn't looking for anything special, just walking, thinking. The key he had found was still in his drawer, but the memory it had shown him was fresh in his mind. He had not spoken to anyone about it. He didn't know how. But when he saw Maren, something felt familiar. She looked thoughtful, quiet, like someone carrying something unseen. They stood near the same shelf, both reaching for a small box of brass objects. Their hands touched, and they both paused. Maren smiled politely, and Leo nodded. They spoke briefly, about the shop, about the weather. But then Maren mentioned the key. She didn't explain everything, just said she had found something strange, something that opened a door to the past. Leo listened carefully. His eyes changed. He told her he had found a key too, and it had shown him something he couldn't forget. They stood in silence for a moment, both understanding without needing more words. That meeting changed everything. They began to meet regularly, sharing what they had seen, what they had felt. They didn't try to explain the magic. They accepted it. They wondered if others had found keys like theirs. So they started asking questions, visiting old shops, talking to quiet people. It wasn't easy. Most didn't understand. But slowly, they found a few. A woman who had seen her childhood home through a door in her attic. A man who had watched his wedding day from behind a mirror. A teenager who had seen the moment he chose silence instead of truth. Each story was different, but the feeling was the same. Regret. Memory. A door that opened but did not let them change anything. Maren began writing down the stories. She kept a notebook, simple and clean, filled with dates, names, and emotions. Leo collected the keys. He didn't know why, but he felt they shouldn't be lost. He kept them in a wooden box, each one wrapped in cloth. They didn't know where the keys came from or why they appeared. But they knew they mattered. Each key was a message, a reminder, a chance to see what had been hidden. Their search became quiet work. They didn't speak loudly or make promises. They listened. They watched. They helped people face what they had buried. Not to fix it, but to understand it. Maren and Leo didn't feel alone anymore. They had found each other, and through their meetings, they had found purpose. The keys had opened more than doors. They had opened hearts. And that was the beginning of something neither of them expected, but both of them needed. Chapter 4. The Memory Room. The house stood at the edge of Utrecht, hidden behind tall trees and a rusted iron gate. It was quiet, forgotten, and covered in ivy. Maren van Dijk and Leo Hartman found it by accident while walking through the older part of the city. The house looked empty, but something about it felt alive. The windows were dusty, and the paint on the walls had faded, but the air around it was still. They stepped inside, not expecting much, but what they found changed everything. The rooms were cold and silent. The floors creaked under their feet, and the walls were lined with doors. Each door was different, some tall, some narrow, some painted, some plain. There were no signs, no numbers, no instructions. But when Leo took out one of the keys he had collected, it pulled him toward a door on the left. He placed the key into the lock, and the door opened slowly. Behind it was a memory, not his own, but someone else's. A woman stood in a kitchen, crying quietly. A child sat nearby, drawing on paper. The scene was soft, sad, and full of silence. Leo watched, unable to speak or move. Then the door closed, and the memory faded. Maren tried another key. Her door opened to a quiet street at night. A man stood under a lamp, holding a letter. He looked lost, unsure. She didn't know who he was, but she felt his pain. The door closed again, and she stood still, thinking. They realized that each key opened a door to a memory, sometimes their own, sometimes someone else's. The house was not just a building. It was a place where the past lived, waiting to be seen. Word spread slowly. People came, one by one, carrying keys they had found in books, boxes, or drawers. They didn't know what to expect, but they were drawn to the house. Some opened doors and cried. Others stood in silence, watching moments they had forgotten or tried to bury. No one could change what they saw. The doors didn't allow that. But something happened inside them. They left lighter, quieter, more aware. Maren began writing down the stories. She kept a journal with dates, names, and feelings. She didn't try to explain the magic. She just recorded what people saw and how they felt. Leo continued collecting keys. He stored them in wooden trays, each labeled with a small note. He didn't know where the keys came from, but he believed they found the right people. The house became a quiet place of healing. No signs were posted. No rules were made. People came because they needed to. The memory room, as they began to call it, was not about fixing the past. It was about facing it. Maren and Leo didn't offer answers. They offered space. And in that space, people found something important. They found the courage to look back, even if it hurt. They found the strength to carry their memories, not as burdens, but as parts of who they were. The house remained quiet, the doors remained closed until the right key arrived. And each time a door opened, someone changed. Not because the past was different, but because they were. Chapter 5. The Nameless Key. Maren van Dyck sat alone in the quiet corner of the library, sorting through a box of old donations. Most of the items were ordinary, books with torn covers, faded postcards, and forgotten bookmarks. But at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of cloth, she found a key. It was different from the others she had seen. There were no letters, no marks, no signs of where it belonged. It was smooth, almost polished by time, and felt warm in her hand. She turned it over slowly, searching for meaning, but found only silence. Something about it made her uneasy. It felt personal, but she didn't know why. That evening, Maren returned to the memory room. The house was quiet, as always, and the air inside was still. She walked past the familiar doors, each one connected to a key she had already seen. But this time, the nameless key pulled her toward a door she had never noticed before. It was plain, with no color or decoration, and looked almost invisible against the wall. She placed the key into the lock, and the door opened without sound. What she saw inside was not what she expected. She stood in a small cafe, dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. At a table near the window sat a man with dark hair and kind eyes. He looked up, and Maren felt something deep inside her shift. She didn't remember this moment clearly, but it felt familiar. The man spoke, and she heard her own voice respond. They were talking about something important, something emotional. She watched herself hesitate, then stand up and walk away. The man stayed seated, looking down at the table, holding a small envelope. Maren felt a wave of sadness. She had forgotten this moment, but now it returned with full weight. The door closed slowly, and she was back in the hallway. Her hands were shaking, and her heart felt heavy. She sat down on the wooden bench near the entrance and tried to understand what she had seen. The man in the cafe was someone she had once loved. She remembered his name now, Daniel. They had shared quiet mornings, long walks, and deep conversations. But one day, she had pushed him away. She had been afraid of being hurt, afraid of losing control. She had chosen silence instead of honesty, and over time, the memory had faded. Until now. Maren realized that regret could be buried, forgotten, even erased from daily thought. But it never truly disappeared. It stayed hidden, waiting for a moment to return. The nameless key had opened a door not to pain, but to truth. She had lost something important, not because of fate, but because of fear. She didn't know where Daniel was now, or if he remembered her. But she knew that the memory mattered. It was part of her, even if she had tried to forget. She wrote about the experience in her journal, using simple words and quiet thoughts. She didn't try to explain the magic of the key. She only described the feeling of seeing a forgotten moment and understanding its meaning. Leo read her notes later and placed the nameless key in a special box, separate from the others. They both knew it was different. It had no symbol because it belonged to a memory that had been lost, not in time, but in heart. That night, Maren walked through the city alone. The streets were calm, and the lights reflected softly on the canals. She didn't feel sad. She felt awake. The key had reminded her that even forgotten choices shape who we are. Regret is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, smooth, and hidden. But when it returns, it asks us to listen. And if we do, we grow. Chapter 6. Leo's Final Door. Leo Hartman woke early that morning, as he always did. The city was still quiet, and the sky outside his window was pale and gray. He made tea, sat by the window, and listened to the ticking of the clocks in his shop below. Time had always been his companion, steady, honest, and never in a hurry. But that morning, something felt different. When he opened the door to his shop, he found a small envelope on the floor. There was no name, no stamp, no sign of who had left it. Inside was a key. It was simple, silver, and cold to the touch. There were no marks, no letters, no symbols. Just a key, waiting. Leo held it for a long time. He had seen many keys by now, each one opening a door to a memory, a moment, a truth. But this one felt heavier. Not in weight, but in meaning. He didn't know why, but he felt it was meant for him, and only him. That evening, after closing the shop, he walked to the memory room. The house stood quiet, as always, its walls lined with doors. He walked slowly, the key in his hand, until he reached a door he had never seen before. It was darker than the others, with a smooth surface and no handle. He placed the key into the lock. It turned easily. The door opened. What Leo saw was not the past. It was the future. He stood in a small hospital room. The light was soft, and the air was still. An old man lay in the bed, himself, older, thinner, quiet. Machines beeped softly. There were no flowers, no cards, no visitors. No one sat by the bed. The room was clean but empty. Leo watched as the older version of himself looked out the window with tired eyes. He saw the silence, the loneliness, the absence of connection. It was not a painful death, but it was a quiet one. Too quiet. The door closed behind him, and Leo stood in the hallway, frozen. He had seen many memories, his own and others, but this was different. This was a warning. A glimpse of what could be, not what had been. He walked home slowly, the streets dark and empty. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at his desk and thought about the people he had lost. Not to death, but to silence. Friends he had stopped calling. Family he had pushed away. Words he had never said. Forgiveness he had never offered. The next morning, Leo began to write. Letters, short and honest. He wrote to his brother, to an old friend he hadn't seen in years, to a woman he once loved but left without a word. He didn't ask for anything. He only shared what he felt, his regrets, his memories, his hope. He picked up the phone and made calls, even when his hands shook. Some people answered. Some didn't. But he tried. And with each letter, each call, something inside him grew lighter. Leo didn't know if the future could truly change. But he knew he could. The key had shown him what might come if he stayed silent. And he didn't want that. He wanted to be remembered not just as a man who fixed clocks, but as someone who tried to fix what time had broken. He returned to the memory room often, not to open more doors, but to sit quietly and listen to others. He became a guide, a quiet presence, someone who understood. The key that had shown him the future was placed in a small wooden box, wrapped in cloth. He didn't need to use it again. It had done its work. It had reminded him that while the past cannot be changed, the future is still open. And sometimes, the most important door is the one that leads forward. Chapter 7. The House Fades. The seasons changed slowly in Utrecht. The trees outside the memory room turned golden, then bare, and the wind grew colder. Maren van Dyck walked to the house each morning, as she had for months, carrying her notebook and a small bag of keys. Leo Hartman arrived later, always with quiet steps and thoughtful eyes. They didn't speak much during those visits anymore. The silence between them was peaceful, filled with understanding. But something had shifted. The house felt different. The air inside was still the same, but the walls seemed less alive. The doors, once full of quiet energy, now stood silent. No new keys had appeared in weeks. No visitors had come. The magic was fading. Maren noticed it first. She opened her notebook and saw that the last story she had written was already days old. She had always felt a pull toward the doors, a gentle invitation to listen and record. Now, that pull was gone. She walked through the hallway, touching the wood of each door, remembering the people who had stood before them. Some had cried. Some had smiled. All had changed. But now, the doors felt like ordinary wood. The house was becoming just a house. Leo felt it too. He opened the drawers where he kept the keys, and they seemed colder. He had once believed the keys chose their moments, arriving when someone needed them. But now, they stayed still. He didn't know why the magic was leaving, but he accepted it. He had seen enough to understand that everything had its time. The house had given people a chance to face their past. It had opened doors not to change history, but to help people carry it better. And now, that work was complete. Together, Marin and Leo began to prepare the house for its closing. They didn't rush. They moved slowly, with care. Marin copied her notes into a clean journal, one that could be saved and passed on. She didn't want the stories to be lost. Each one was a piece of someone's heart. Leo wrapped the keys in cloth and placed them in a wooden box. He locked it and placed it in the attic, under the floorboards. Not to hide it, but to let it rest. They cleaned the rooms, closed the windows, and locked the doors. The house didn't resist. It simply became quiet. On the last day, they stood outside and looked at the building. It looked smaller now, older, like it had always been just another forgotten house. No one passing by would notice anything special. But Marin and Leo knew what had happened there. They knew the doors had opened not just to memories, but to healing. They didn't feel sad. They felt grateful. The house had done what it was meant to do. And now, it could sleep. Marin returned to her work at the library. She kept the journal on a shelf near her desk, where she could see it every day. Sometimes she opened it and read a story, remembering the faces and voices. Leo continued repairing watches, but he also began teaching young apprentices. He spoke gently, not just about gears and springs, but about time and memory. He never mentioned the house, but he carried it with him. The house faded from the city's memory. People stopped talking about the strange doors and the quiet magic. But the memory remained in those who had walked through it. They didn't need to return. They had already taken what they needed. And in quiet moments, when the wind moved softly through the trees, Marin and Leo sometimes felt the echo of the house. Not in sound, but in feeling. A reminder that some places are not meant to last forever, but they leave something behind that does. Chapter 8. Echo of Keys. Years passed quietly in Utrecht. The city changed slowly, but the rhythm of life stayed gentle. Marin van Dijk no longer worked at the library. She had become a writer, spending her days at a small desk near the window of her apartment. Her shelves were filled with notebooks, drafts, and letters. She wrote stories about memory, silence, and the quiet ways people carry their past. She never mentioned the house directly, but its spirit lived in her words. Her books were simple and honest, and readers often said they felt understood. Marin didn't write to be famous. She wrote to help people feel less alone. Leo Hartman had also changed. He still repaired watches, but he had opened a small workshop school for young people who wanted to learn the craft. He taught them how to listen to the ticking, how to feel the weight of time in their hands. But more than that, he taught them patience, care, and the value of small things. He didn't speak about the memory room, but sometimes he told quiet stories about choices, about forgiveness, and about how time can teach us if we let it. His students respected him not just for his skill, but for his kindness. Sometimes, Marin and Leo met for coffee in a quiet cafe near the canal. They talked about books, clocks, and the people they had met. And sometimes they heard stories from strangers, stories about strange keys found in old drawers or doors that appeared and disappeared. They listened carefully, knowing the magic had faded, but the echo remained. The house was gone, but its message had spread. People were still finding pieces of themselves in unexpected places. The keys were no longer physical. They had become moments, questions, memories that asked to be faced. Maren once received a letter from a reader who had found a key inside a book at a second-hand shop. The reader didn't know what it meant, but said it made them remember something they had forgotten. Maren smiled and placed the letter in a box with others. She didn't reply with answers. She believed the key had already done its work. Leo, too, heard stories from his students about dreams, about doors, about feelings they couldn't explain. He didn't try to explain them. He simply listened. They both understood now that the keys had never been about time. They had been about acceptance. About facing the past not to change it, but to understand it. Everyone who had walked through a door had returned with something new, not a solution, but a shift. A small freedom. A quiet strength. The house had faded, but the echo of its doors lived on in the people who had once opened them. Maren continued to write. Leo continued to teach. And sometimes, when the wind moved through the trees just right, they felt the memory of the house. Not as a place, but as a feeling. A reminder that regret is not punishment, it is a sign that something mattered. And if you are ready to open the door, you are ready to accept yourself. Moral. Some doors do not open with force, they open with readiness. The past cannot be changed, but it can be faced. Regret is not a punishment, it is a quiet teacher. And when we choose to listen, we begin to heal. The keys were never about unlocking time. They were about unlocking truth. And every person who dared to walk through their own memory found not a perfect ending, but a deeper beginning. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.